Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah, this is now episode 64 of the podcast, The Forward, myself, Brother Mahdi Locke, author of The Big Step. And Alhamdulillah, I am joined again today by Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali.
Assalamu alaikum.
And today's topic is the secular mindset. A very important topic. And we are discussing this now because what we have noticed over probably, I would say, the past 15 to 20 years is that spokesmen for Islam in the West or in the Anglosphere, after spending several years telling us not to reconcile to the world, for example, telling us don't go to school, don't go to the mainstream government schools, don't watch TV, get rid of your TV, don't vote, don't get involved in the political system, consider Hijrah, and so on and so forth, build a community, for example. They are now doubling back and telling us to reconcile to the world. So, for example, we now have spokesmen for Islam in the West talking about Islam and evolution theory, saying, I don't want to hear the theologian refuting evolution. I want to hear the theologian who's also an evolutionary biologist or vice versa. We have other spokesmen for Islam in the West fully advocating the anthropogenic global warming agenda or quote-unquote climate change, mocking people who are skeptical of it, mocking people who are skeptical of vaccines and things like this, telling us that we need to follow the Catholic model, how they did things in the United States, or the Jewish model. And what we're seeing is that there is a rather clear distinction being made between religion and science. That's what they talk about. Well, I'm a religious scholar. I talk about religious issues. I don't go into what is called science. Why this is a secular mindset? Is there anything you'd like to add?
So the secular mindset, alhamdulillah. So the secular mindset that's coming about is coming about on account of the education, if we're calling it that in quotation marks, that they've received. So these spokesmen for Islam in the West have received a certain type of education and they advocate a certain type of thinking. Now they would say that they're being independent thinkers, that they are reaching out and trying to be people of tajdeed and islah. But that's not what's happened. They have not distinguished between the thoughts that they actually have as human beings and an entire paradigm and an entire system and construct that's been given to them, like a bicycle helmet or a motorcycle helmet that gets put over you that blocks your peripheral vision. That's been given to them. And then when they finish that 15 years of schooling, they've come out of that and they carry on through that. Previously, how Muslims had dealt with science, and maybe it's an important point to understand that our original scientists were scholars in a field. They were scholars in many fields and scholars in a particular field, and then a science grew out of that. So an example would be this. You had scholars who were ulama and had also looked into the science of determining the qibla and other things such as this. So in the process of doing that, which was an ilm in order to determine the qibla and the direction of the qibla and the ilm al-falakiyya and things such as this, in the process of doing that, a fen then came out of that. The fen that came out of that was ilm al-nujum, which is astronomy. So the ilm al-nujum came out of ilm al-falakiyya. It was a runoff. So no one would ever study the funun. So by people not just studying the funun, what that meant was there was a basis that things came out of. And here's what I mean by that. Before that time, people found no reason to study the movement of stars except for the purpose of determining the qibla and other factors. That's all they studied it for. Then, once they had actually nailed down those sciences, then a separate science broke off from that, a fen, in which people now studied the stars for a purpose other than determining the qibla. So that now became something separate to that, which is known as a fen, because it was no longer an ilm, because ilm at that point was only connected to the sciences of the shadow.
How would you translate fen?
Fen, I suppose you'd call a subscience or a soft science or something like that. but it's not an ilm. It's not a science. So these are actual ulum in which they're sciences, but the fen was like a sub-science or a periphery science because it wasn't connected to the revealed law. It's something that you're doing naturalistically because you're studying it off to the side. You're not trying to derive any benefit that will go towards the shara or anything like that. You're not necessarily doing it as a direct ibadah. It might be an indirect ibadah. And the same thing happened with math. People that originally brought about the calculus as well as the algebra was for the purpose of ilm al-fara'id.
Yeah.
But then later that spun off into other sciences where you start looking at conic forms and you start getting quadratic equations. That's not necessarily for inheritance. So it becomes a fen. Now, when this occurred, that's how these scholars viewed it. Whereas when you look at the Western model, the people that brought about their sciences had broken away from religion. They tried to start fresh, and in the process created fen with no usul. And they denied the basis of their civilization and what it was based upon. So they saw the beginning of their funun as the necessary break from the civilization. So there's no fen. So when you go back, if you go back, say through geology, you'll reach the 1700s, then there's nothing. Because they broke from religion. Those people had to break from a religion of the belief that the world was 6,000 years old or so, and then to come into the position regarding geology that the earth is older and it's a process of uniformitarianism or catastrophism. They had to break with that. So the actual fen, there's nothing behind it. And these were laymen that did this. You know, they weren't scholars. They weren't looking for a goal. These were laymen. Now, the people that then leave with this understanding that come to the United States that are the seeds of the secularism, George Washington and people such as this, they built that civilization with the idea in mind that let's build a civilization that's devoid of religion. And they built it with that fen versus usul mindset. Now, true enough, others had also left, like Catholics had come here, Quakers, Mennonites, other people that had also fled because of persecution or other reasons. But it wasn't for the purpose of setting up anything. But these men that went and built the United States civilization, built it with a goal in mind, and that this would be a place in which religion played no part. We're starting the clock over. That's why obviously the United States gets referred to as the Promised Land or the New Jerusalem or the New Earth.
Yeah. So this is what we're leading into is that the second part here. This is the second part of our discussion, which is the secular foundation of the U.S.
Yeah.
And how this affects the rest of the Anglosphere. So, what did the founding fathers have in mind when they were establishing this country?
Well, what they had in mind is that there'd be no establishment of religion. So the state could not legislate religion. It could not establish it, but it could also not legislate and go against religion either. It was to be free of religion. Its guiding principles, just as when you read in the Constitution that they're talking about a God. When you actually read the writings of Thomas Jefferson, who's the one that framed the Constitution, who was responsible for the wording of the Constitution, he meant the God of nature, which is not any God that you and I would have anything to do with regarding revelation. They didn't believe that there was revelation. They didn't believe that there was a personal relationship between creator and creation. They did not believe that he had any attributes, and if he did, they were wholly unknown, and there was no way to make any connection. He just made the creation and then left it. So this was their understanding of a God of nature. It's not really a God as you and I would understand. It's more of a principle. It's more of a force. It's more of a guiding impact. It's more of a guiding principle, the golden mean, if you will.
Yeah. The same with people like George Washington. He was.
Yeah. It was Freemasonic, deistic. You know, they don't have any connection to religion that you and I would recognize in any formal sense.
Yeah, because if you obviously you can find pictures of these people wearing the Freemasonic symbols, the apron, the square and compass, and that kind of stuff. Okay. So, to take this further, so next question is, how does the U.S. education system inculcate secularism?
Right. So when they start off, they'll take you through 4 different levels. Now, I was homeschooled for a period of my life, and then the United States government got involved and insisted if everyone has a right to a U.S. an American education. So if you do not enroll him, then he will possibly be taken by the state. So I was then brought into the U.S. school system. Now, I had not started from kindergarten. I came in at 8, 9 years old. But they start you off in kindergarten, and you go into elementary school, in which all religions are equal. So when you start off, I come into school and they're having you sing Nam Ho Yo Ring Ye Kyo, the Buddhist chant. They're having you massage each other, massage other classmates on the shoulders around 3 o'clock or around 2:50. They're showing you how to put condoms on bananas. They're bringing in the book Heather Has Two Mommies. They're bringing in two men that say that they're husband and wife, two women as well that are deep throat kissing in front of the class, showing you open sexuality and other things such as this. So all religions are equal, but they're also showing you that religion has no business and can't account for things like marriage, sex, showing you penetrative sexual intercourse on video. So religion has nothing to say about these things. Religion is something that you happen to carry with you, and that's what you are, but it has no teeth. It's this whole thing with the toothless religion. It's completely toothless. The second stage is where you get to middle school, in which you now have science replacing religion. So science explains what religion can't. And what science can't explain now, eventually in the future it will. So they'll say, well, the reason why people were religious is they didn't know what fire was. They didn't know why the sun stood still in the sky for in the month of December near the later part. They didn't know why. They didn't know how the moon worked. They didn't know how the world around them worked. So what happened is they used religion, and they would actually superimpose themselves. They would create gods that were made in their own image, and they would project themselves. And this was a way of making man eternal, because they were scared of death, and so they didn't want to die. So by projecting themselves onto the world as gods and making images in their own likeness, it was a way of perpetuating man's continued survival. So that was middle school. In junior high school, near the end of junior high school, you then start to get introduced into the mythology of religion, which is through Joseph Campbell. That religion is a myth. These myths are used to help people understand their world around them. It's used to help for people to give themselves a better shot in life, and so on and so forth. Now, once you reach the high school stage, now there's open hostility to religion in the textbooks. Religion's holding you back. Religion's a crutch. And then you'll hear the usual canards that are said, that all the wars that have ever been have been about religion. All religion is bad. Look what it's brought the world. All the world's been a religion. All the world's religions have blood on their hands. All these types of things are brought in, but you had to go through that process first. The toothless religion that was quaint and cute, and you might like it and things like that. You might exchange gifts, and everyone had to celebrate everyone's holidays. Then when you reach high school, then there's the open hostility to religion. Now, because you'd learned this toothless religion, starting off, if you had no interaction with your parents or anything to lean on, by the time you get to high school, you're completely defenseless, because science is new. It's always developing. Look at the glossy books. Look at everything that's going on. Look at all these new advancements we're making. We've been to the moon and back, and they had you in middle school. They wanted us to do a projection. Where do you see us in 20 years' time? And so students were saying, oh, there's going to be moon bases. There's going to be all these other things. We're not even going to have to use the refrigerator, because the refrigerator will come to us on wheels, and it will open up and say, what would you like to have, sir? And all these other types of things that they told you as a child. And religion played no part in that. You never learned about great inventors who were Muslim, like Muslim inventors or Muslim scientists or Muslim scholars, or the fact that it was a Orthodox Jew who came up with the cure for polio. Right, and how he was silenced and all these other things, or inventors like Elisha Gray, who preceded Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. None of that was discussed, because that's going to interfere in this whole 15-year process of grooming and creating a human being, a new human being.
Yeah, and that's why I'm thinking back when I was that age, when I came out of high school. Like if you started talking about religion, you start talking about Islam, at the age of 18, 19, 20 years old, you always get that refrain of, but science. Even if they can't explain it, even if they can't go into the details as to why you're wrong.
Yeah. I might not be able to explain it, but science does have an answer. There was that assumption. Science definitely has an answer. Science definitely does have an answer. And this whole thing it's a complex, just like you have the military-industrial complex. When we first came up to the elementary school, I'm on the bus, the 415 route, and it comes up and it has the elementary school at the bottom of the sign, and at the top it reads educational industrial complex. So that it means this is a system. It's not just like the military industrial complex. It's an entire structure.
Yeah, it's a factory.
Yeah.
It's churning out something.
Yeah.
So people were in that I think I would discuss it with another brother about this. I think they call it scientism.
Yes.
This sort of absolute faith that science does have the answer somewhere, even if it's not apparent to us now.
That's it.
It will come later.
And the dialectical materialism as well, that dialectical materialism is all of the world that we see around us is all that there is. It's all that there is, right? There is nothing else, which is obviously our scholars were Muslim. So we don't have that understanding, but also our understanding of science was different, because the point of science was how things happen, not why. But what's happened with people that are engaged in dialectical materialism, they're not content with just explaining how things happen, but now they're trying to come out with an entire theory of life. Why did the universe get created? Why did this happen? So they're trying to answer questions that it's not science's point to answer. Mm-hmm. Science is to deal with, the whole point of science is coming to conclusions based upon measuring observable data.
Yeah.
So you start off with the hypothesis phase, then the theory, and then if it's able to be replicated and everything else, then it becomes a fact, right? Because it's been replicated so many times. But something not being scientifically measurable didn't mean it was a fact.
Yeah.
But the U.S. made it so no, if it can't be scientifically measurable, then it's not a fact. And that's not the case, because there's things that can't be replicated that are facts. Yeah. They're not replicable, but they're facts, right? There's things that you cannot scientifically trace directly that are facts. Like if you said to someone, what is the evidence that your mother is indeed your birth mother, right? Now you have that they told you that you resemble them. You have paperwork, but someone could say, well, the paperwork, that's not proof. People forge paperwork. My parents told me. So people tell people things all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I look like them. That's fine. But there's people that when they're married, they start looking like each other after a certain period of time. That's not proof either. So it's like, it's not that you don't have evidence. It's that it's not scientifically measurable, because the point of science is to measure things that are replicable, and that's the point of what science is. But that doesn't mean that something that's not measurable by scientific means isn't a fact. Yeah. And that's something our scholars understood. There's a difference between science in terms of, your measuring of numbers and hisab, your math and things like that. There's a difference between using pure math versus observable data and things like this.
Yeah, and that's why Imam Muhammad Siddhartha al-Bolti in his book Kinyat al-Kawniyya, he goes into these issues about how do we establish the creation of the world, the creation of the universe. That's not, we can't replicate that.
Yeah.
But we have sound khabar regarding this. Yeah. And the fact that Allah says in Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter, verse 51, I did not make them witness the creation of heavens and the earth, or the creation of themselves.
Yeah, they weren't around.
Yeah, so everything they're doing, everything they're producing, evolution theory and so forth, the Big Bang theory, this is just they're just going by circumstantial evidence at best. They don't have anything clear cut.
Well, when you address people about these topics, one of the things you'll get down to, if you're able to, and they always have these problems, especially when it's people on the street, because people on the street have by and large imbibed it without really reflecting sometimes, is you say, okay, this knowledge that we have of the world around us, that it's for a fact that we evolved and we are just monkeys with opposable thumbs and these other types of things that we say. The fact of saying that that's a fact, are we saying this because this is this knowledge acquired knowledge, or is it ineffable knowledge, or knowledge that is non-acquirable? It's capable of being seen in of itself. When they say it's capable of being seen in of itself, then you start asking them questions about rock formations and everything else. Okay, is that knowledge capable of being gleaned by each and every individual? Well, no. Okay, then it's acquired. And if it's acquired knowledge, that means it has to be gathered from someone else. If it has to be gathered from someone else, then that means it's based upon measurements and data. So then it's not obvious to everyone. But they act as if evolutionary science and things like this, these positions are just known to everyone. Yeah. It's just a fact that everyone knows the difference between igneous and obsidian rock. Everyone knows this is andesite and no, they don't. This is acquired knowledge. It's not absolute knowledge. So then when you deny evolution, or people say, listen, I don't think that's the case, they act as if you're denying something so fundamental as the fact of that trees growing, or some facts like,
the sun moving from east to west.
Yeah, that clouds bring rainfall and things like this. It's not a denial.
Yeah, because they have that fixed in mind. Because obviously the way the evolution theory is set up, I mean, there's an article on my blog you can read about this, but the way the evolution theory is set up, it's like proof texting. It's like they've drawn a conclusion first, and then they've interpreted evidence.
They look for evidence.
Yeah, they look for the evidence, and they interpret all the evidence to mean that. So, okay, they find a fossil. We find fossil somewhere. They find an old skeleton somewhere. They say, oh, this is one of the intermediate forms. It fits in here somewhere in the.
And if you look at it, if you look at their mindset, from their standpoint, it makes perfect sense. Because remember when we discussed the fen and the asl, it makes perfect sense because they don't have any usul.
Yeah.
So they're starting from the fen,
yeah,
and then they're building their usul going back.
Exactly.
They're not starting from an usul and then the funun come out of that. They're starting with a fen, and then they're working their way back and building their usul because there's nothing in the back.
Allah. That is quite deep. So, to follow on from this is something we mentioned at the beginning. So you have this religion versus science dichotomy. This is what I noticed when I saw some of these statements that were being made by spokesman for Islam in the West. I just thought, wait a second, this guy's making a clear distinction between religion and science. You say, I don't want to hear the Muslim theologian refuting evolution theory. I want to hear the Muslim theologian who's also studied molecular biology or whatever it is.
These are sons of the Renaissance that you're hearing.
Yeah.
These are the illegitimate sons of the Renaissance.
So if we go into this, religion versus science. So, as we said before, the objective here is to divest people of religion. That's why they create that dichotomy. So, who are the people who started this notion?
Okay.
This way of thinking.
In order to properly have a good layout of the current set of circumstances as they stand, there are three main people that are the fathers of what we call the New Age. Now, before they come into it, you need something else that happens around the same time, which is known as the 1893 Parliament of World Religions. This is the first incident that they have in Chicago, in which they begin to introduce religion through secular means. All the different religions of the East, all the different religions of the world, they've brought them all together. And they bring together all of this for the purpose of melding them together and then disseminating them into the rest of the world, particularly the United States. So they had yoga introduced through non-religious means. So now you have Muslim sisters today that are just doing yoga. It's been stripped of its religion, but these are religious postures. This is religious behavior, but they're just doing it without thinking about it. So they introduced all these things. They introduced a form of Islam that was toothless, that was palatable, that was mixed with Hinduism. So you had people going to a Hindu ashram and saying they were Sufis.
Yeah, Hindu Sufis.
Yeah, you had these things. You had what were called Buddhist Christians. They introduced all this, and it was absolutely necessary. Now, the men that helped in the building of this huge, for lack of a better word, I'd sort of call it an edifice, are Albert Pike, who was the 33rd degree Mason, and made it very clear that the only God that he or anyone else should have anything to do with is Satan. That's the original God of man. You had Aleister Crowley, who revived the study of the ancient gods and, really old deities and old false religion.
Did he call himself the Antichrist as well?
Yes, called himself the Antichrist. And you have Anton Sens de Levy, who was a lapsed Christian Jewish type figure who founded the Church of Satan. And it's from him that all these other things spread. So these people are the architects, or mujaddidun, the renewers of the New Age movement. There's these renewers of old religion. So what they're saying it's New Age because it's new for the people now, but it's actually quite ancient.
It's old occult religions.
That's it. Occult religions, mystery cults, sex cults.
Going back 2,000 years or more.
That's it. Temple prostitution, all these other things they're introducing through this secular mindset, because people often say that, well, the Americans are godless and everything else. Well, they're not godless in the sense that they don't believe in anything. They just don't believe in things like you understand. When you look at how their cities are built and everything, there's all these esoteric things and occult things like, floors without a number 13 and all these other things. They believe in something.
And the black and white checkered floors.
Yeah, all these types of things.
Obelisks.
Yeah, all these types of things show that they do believe in something.
Yeah.
It's just not what we would associate in a formal sense with any real religion, with any revelation, or with any doctrine. So these people that begin disseminating this type of religion then bring in people who are also affected through syncretism, the mixing of these religions through the secularization of the New Age. So they start to impact people like Idris Shah, William Chittick, that's it, Martin Lings, these people. And so now you have Sufism being mixed together with yoga, the hippie movement, transcendental meditation gets brought in. So you have Swami Prabhupada Bhaktivedanta. He comes now into the West, and he for the first time you have this huge dissemination of Hindu literature.
What time is this?
This is the 60s.
60s.
Okay, the 60s. And the Beatles were impacted by him, so much so that on the back of one of their albums they have a photo of him, and then there's a photo of Aleister Crowley, and there's a photo of the original yogi from the 1893 convocation of the world religions, Parliament of World Religions. He's on the back.
So, but who actually arranged this first Parliament of World Religions?
First Parliament of World Religions was arranged by the Vatican.
So the Vatican.
So this is in the run-up. This is before First Vatican. This is before Second Vatican. This was arranged by the Vatican.
So this almost fits into the theory that people have about the Vatican and London and Washington.
Sure,
being sort of an axis of power and
absolutely
controlling things.
It's not unheard of, because people often look and then they realize, wait a minute, the Pope is not just a religious figure; he's also the King of Vatican City. Yeah. He has a seat in the UN.
I mean, that's a separate state outside of Italy.
He has a separate entity,
just like DC is not actually part of the United States.
Yeah, all these other
types of things. City of London is not actually part of the UK.
That's it. So once people have seen these things, they start to realize that, wait a minute, there's more to the Pope. It's like, why are all these world leaders visiting him that aren't Catholic? George Bush isn't Catholic. You know, Tony Blair, before his conversion to Catholicism, was visiting him. You have Donald Trump visiting him. What's he visiting him for? Yeah. Melania Trump is not Catholic. She's Orthodox. So why are all these people visiting him that aren't his religion? It's because he has not only spiritual power, but temporal power. And it's with that the first Parliament of World Religions is open. In no other place than Chicago, which, interestingly enough, in Spanish, Chicago means toilet.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whereabouts? I just remember that one of those early American conferences. What was his name? Alexander Russell Webb, that guy. Was he based in Chicago, or was that New York?
I'm not sure. And another one of these Sufism syncretists, another one is Titus Burckhardt.
Yes,
he's another one.
Yes,
he's another guy. So you had Titus Burckhardt, Idris Shah, William Chittick, all these types of people, Martin Lings, all these people. Yes, all these types of people where you'd see like pictures of them. Oh, yes, this person is a Sufi master. It's like, when did he become a Sufi master? It's like, well, in order to be a scholar in the science of ihsan, you also need to understand the shara.
Yeah.
And you can see that these people don't understand shara, but you see pictures of them dressed up. You know, in their finery or whatever, their splendor, whatever it is they're wearing. But then you also see when they're teaching in their normal day-to-day life, suit and tie.
Yeah.
You know, because for them, this is, you know, which we'll probably come to later, this is like a dress-up event.
Yeah.
This is something that they're doing just as, you know, because the hippie time, this 60s time, was a time of rebelling and throwing off the shackles of the past.
What's actually happening, say, between 1893 and the 1960s? What's actually happening in that sort of
what's happening in the U.S. is that you're getting the generations that exist. So when you're looking at up to the 50s, there's a very conservative, two parents were in the home, family structure system in the United States. When you start getting, when they make headway, the Parliament of World Religions and the other stuff starts to gain momentum, that starts to get undermined.
Okay.
And so now it becomes a situation of, well, who are you to say what a family is? You can be a family without, and who are you to say that, you know, if they have a love child, who are you to blame? You know, someone can have a child without, and all these other things. It was still being resisted, but there was open opposition that began. Ideas about religion, ideas about the nature of who our Lord is. So it was in that time, in the 60s, that people started saying, well, why not she? They think it's revolutionary now. That stuff started then. Why not she?
Yeah.
Why not this? You start seeing paintings and all these other things people were coming out with. People declaring themselves deity.
Yeah.
Right? People traveling the world. So there were people from well-to-do families that started traveling the world to try to find themselves and all these other things. And then they'd come back and declare themselves the head of whatever order. So people were doing it with the Hindu orders, with the various Hindu orders or Jains. They would come back and someone would declare himself a Jain priest. And it happened with some Muslims as well. Someone would go away and come back and declare himself the Muqaddim of the Sufis and things like this. So it's the same thing happened.
Same. Yeah, because if we go back, though, obviously with the major wars at that time, from 1914, 1918, and then 1939, 1945, that also had a massive impact on the family structure.
Yeah,
I mean,
because so many men had been killed, the women were behind.
And the women had gone to the factories and so on and so forth. I remember, I actually asked this question when I was a kid. I asked my dad this question because I was shocked that Winston Churchill did not win the first election after the war, and after 1945.
Even though he was a wartime leader.
Yeah, he's the wartime leader. He's the hero. And my dad said, "Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. What you're thinking, because you would think that people would just re-elect him out of gratitude and so on and so forth."
Because Bush did against Kerry. Bush was a wartime president,
Yeah.
and people felt that he had success. So he had a landslide where he killed Kerry in the landslide. So thought, okay, well, why wouldn't he be reelected?
Yeah, but with Churchill, as my dad explained to me, is that he wasn't reelected because even though he had won the war, he was seen as a relic of the past. Like he was seen as, he represented the conservatism of the 1930s,
Right.
where women were still in the home and they weren't going to the factories, they weren't getting out.
People didn't want to be associated with that anymore.
So they wanted to move on from that.
Right.
So because women had now experienced that quote unquote freedom, they were now wanted to keep going that direction.
Right.
So the 50s were still conservative, but then as you get into the 60s, things start breaking down and people have different ideas. And then a major thing that comes up at that time is the invention of birth control.
Yeah.
Because that's early 1960s as well.
Tampons as well.
And the pill and all that kind of stuff. So now women are liberated where now they can go around and fornicate and not
They're mobile.
not get pregnant and so on and so forth. And that obviously
Had wide-reaching implications.
Yes. So moving on from that to the 1960s, I think we mentioned Joseph Campbell as well. So he also said something about religion as a means of connecting to the relics of your past.
Yes.
Ritual reenactment.
So Joseph Campbell, you had to hear about him in junior high school.
What age is he from?
He's in the 20th century. He was seen as a 20th century savant and scholar of many different disciplines. So you had to know about him in junior high school. In university, I had to study about him, and other people had before, and they found him profoundly boring. But you had to study about him. And although he, as a speaker, he made you feel as if you should end it all and jump from the highest window in your house. As a public speaker, he was terrible. But as a writer, he was very effective, pithy, concise, and sharp. And so some of the things that he mentioned about, like looking at religion as along the process of man's evolution.
Yeah.
So man finds out about fire and the world around him, and he realizes he's part of a bigger world than himself. He's part of an ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so when he realizes he's part of an ecosystem, he realizes that we're all connected.
Yeah.
But at first he starts to try to deify himself. So he paints his face. He puts on the habit of animals around him. He tries to imitate the natural processes that he sees around him. He projects religion and gods. He creates religions. He sends prophets. He takes recreational drug use in order to try to rise above his lower nature and all these other things. And then eventually he reaches the sweet spot is where we are now. Where we're the completed human being. But we still, because we're in that evolutionary process, we have to reach back every now and then because of our reptilian brain and our evolutionary process. We need to do these reenactments to relive our past. So going to the sweat lodges, or getting involved with a quote unquote Sufi brotherhood, or doing these ritualistic reenactments where you dress up as people from the past, or you dress up as these people. So you'll notice that when people are dressing up as these past relics, their clothing is really bedazzling and outrageous. It's not normal. You can look at the time period and see people from the Victorian time didn't dress that way.
Yeah.
But Victorian reenactors the clothing is really bizarre and it's just completely, it's just obnoxious the way it's dressed because this is nothing like how they dressed. But it's done for the purpose of this reenactment, and religion is seen as this reenactment, getting in touch with your past, more primitive, infantile self as you're rising to your higher level.
So for example, so he would say something like, so Muslims going on Hajj.
Yes.
It's a reenactment.
It's a reenactment.
You're going over something that happened in the past.
That the Mela in India, Jews going to the Wailing Wall, Christians visiting Vatican City, Native Americans doing powwows and the beating of the drum. These are all relics of your ancient primitive past, which is just as much a part of you but is now remote. But you need to always reenact that ritual to remember how far you've come, and also the danger of slipping back into that barbarism, because he said that civilization is a thin veneer that can be yanked away at any one time, and barbarism's waiting to get back in.
Yeah. So I guess in his way of thinking, he would think that when you look at all the quote-unquote world religions, these are simply products of evolution. So Islam evolved in the Middle East, Buddhism evolved in the Far East, Christianity is a European, North African, Middle Eastern thing, and so on and so forth. And they just evolved over time, and now we've reached the stage where here we are with evolution.
That's it.
Obviously, we're all connected one way or another.
That's it. We're getting closer together to something global as well. We're coming together globally. The world's now getting closer and more interconnected, which means that we now don't need these localized religions anymore.
So, all right. So the way he would think, and not just him, but this whole agenda, is the fact that so we sort of started from one source according to evolution. Just so we started from one common ancestor. We have one common ancestral religion, so to speak.
Yes.
We split up over time. The Arabs got this, the Chinese got this, the Europeans got this, and so on and so forth. And now we've realized what's happened through our evolution, and now we're going to come back and come together again.
That's it. Back into this perennial thing. And then you can understand why perennialism comes out of all that.
Exactly.
Because this is all, it's seeing religion as just these spin-offs of these evolutionary things along the track. So perennialism makes sense. Because it's part of the evolutionary process. And they might not believe it at the time that they're getting involved with religious indifferentism and syncretism and all these other things, but they are sharing in this evolutionary theory.
Yeah, so they're kind of tied together, evolution theory and perennialism.
You can't, because they build off of each other. It's impossible to understand Campbell's belief on religion and mythology without understanding evolution. Because he believes they're part of the same thing, because he was very studied in evolution. He was heavily studied in evolution. So when he's approaching religion, that's the mindset he's approaching it with.
Right. Okay, so now when we look at the spokesman for Islam in the West, in the Anglosphere, so they're becoming Muslim in the 1960s and 1970s.
Right. Having gone through the same 15-year system we just discussed.
Exactly. And they're doing a lot of these other things you were mentioning where they're going these journeys of discovery, right? They're going to
because they're from well-to-do families.
Yeah, and they're going to the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, or they're going to India, and they're looking for some spiritual high, or to meet some exotic people.
Yeah,
drugs are obviously involved. For a lot of them, they do mention this
in the early days. Yeah.
So they're rebelling against their parents. This is the interesting thing, because I mentioned this in my book, The Big Step. Obviously, because they're finding Islam attractive because it's part of that counterculture. That's what they want to couch it. It's counterculture. It's anti-establishment. It's radical.
So they identify with Islam. They erroneously identify Islam with a left-leaning thinking.
Yeah, and then they bring that back, and they're using rebelling against their parents, but their parents are going to be mostly conservative.
Yes. Right.
So they're using Islam to rebel against a conservative worldview.
And to badger their parents.
And then what that means is that they're actually inadvertently attacking, undermining Islam, when Islam actually would have been appealing and attractive.
Yeah, because of its conservative value. So what they're doing is they're distorting the image of Islam to their parents, and based upon what they're presenting to their parents are rejecting Islam out of hand.
Yeah.
And part of the fault of it is not just the kufr of their parents; it's the fault of their rebellious children who failed to understand Islam.
Yeah, they didn't understand properly. And now it's been that way ever since.
Yeah.
So now you've got Muslim Congress people, I don't know what they are, men or women, Congress people now advocating late-term abortions, just completely engrossed in the left liberal progressive agenda.
Well, what they did is they went from going against what they had previously, what their parents and everything had been upon, to now doubling back. And it goes back to something that is often mentioned by educators in the United States, that children, when they're young, and this is why they want them in school as young as possible, they go through this recording phase where they just watch with their eyes, and their eyes are cameras, and they just record everything. Then when you hit 16, 17, 18, you're in your playback phase.
Yeah.
So the playback phase is you reenact and you practice in thought and action everything you've learned up until that time.
Yeah.
So what they're doing is, now someone could ask, well, why did they wait until so late? Well, because they went through this rebellious phase of taking drugs and everything else. What happened is it staggered the playback time. It's like it became delayed. It's like when you stagger, your gas bill or your electricity bill and say, okay, well, I want to delay it. I'm going to pay it on this date.
Yeah.
Eventually it comes around where you can't delay it any longer. And it's the same thing. They delayed it. Now they're in this playback phase. And it seems so weird that they're flip-flopping. But if you actually look at it in perspective, it totally makes sense, because they're playing back all that 15 years of education that they never shook, that they never debriefed, that they never got rid of. And so when they talk about Islam, oh, well, that's North African Islam. Yeah. That's Syrian Islam. That's an Egyptian form of Islam, because they have that evolutionary thinking in their mind. Right. And that's impacted upon them. So now when they're coming out, advocating late-term abortions, and that evolution should be taught, and that if you don't like it,
and the homosexual agenda.
Yes, and if you don't like compulsory vaccinations, then you should just leave and go somewhere else, and all these other things, and going to UN summits on vaccinations and all these other things. Yeah. These things are all happening because of their playback and that 15 years of education. They don't realize how important that was.
Yeah, so these spokesmen for Islam in the West, these people, I think they're referred to in my book, The Big Step, as the hippie converts, because that's the time they became Muslim. So they were never deprogrammed. That's why we're stressing it. They were never deprogrammed. They jumped into Islam. They studied what they studied. Obviously, they learned the Arabic language, and they met fuqaha, they did all these things.
Yeah.
But something wasn't exactly penetrating, because that programming was still very much in place. The 15-year program was still very much in place.
They didn't abandon that system, so they came back with the understanding that it's still true. And that's why the way they came back, so when you look and say, okay, well, they came back during this year and that year, and you can see that, okay, what's their literary output? What's their community output? Like if they built a hospital, have they done this, have they done that? Well, no, they haven't done any of these things. Why? Because they never let go of the fact that there was error in what they knew.
Yeah.
That what they had learned during that time in their education was a lie. They never learned that. The Berbers, why they were able to get done, or the Amazigh, so much in Islam, why they represented so much, why they were able to do so much, is because of letting go of the kufr and the shirk that they had been in. The Arabs letting go of the kufr and the shirk that they had been in. The Jami Bani Umayyah, Al-Azhar, Qarawin, none of these were possible without a complete understanding that the kufr and the shirk that we were on before has to be discarded, including the mindset of kufr and shirk. I mean, a great example of this would be, there were companions who converted to Islam, and they still sometimes had to be reminded and keep going through the process of being deprogrammed. Like the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Send salat and salam upon me, even when I'm deceased, for I will return it." And one of the companions said, "How can that be? When you're deceased, you'll be mixed with the dust and bones and dirt of the earth." Now wait a minute. We've already established before that the people that are dead, they're alive in their graves.
Yeah.
But the Prophet ﷺ did not say, "You fool, how could you not know?" No, he understood that this is 23 years of deprogramming they have to undergo. So he said, no, the earth does not take anything from the bodies of the prophets.
Yeah.
It's been forbidden from doing so. So when you send salat and salam upon me, then I'll be returned to you. Or when some of the people had seen their deceased killed on the battlefield in Badr, some of them said, well, now look, we'll never see our family again.
Yeah.
And Allah sent down the ayat. That is not the case. They're being sustained. They're alive, but you do not know. Yeah. They had to be reminded of that, because they're coming out of that mindset of once you're dead, you're dead.
Yeah.
And that takes a long time to break. So at the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the peninsula is complete.
Yeah.
That mindset is done for.
Yeah.
But it took 23 years to get rid of that, because for over 1,000 years they were upon idolatry and all these other things. So that's not a game.
Yeah.
1,000 years is not a small thing to look at. And 15 years, especially your formative 15 years, is not a minor or small thing to look at. They've been impacted.
Yeah. That's very, very hard to shake that off, because we were discussing this earlier, and we've discussed this in other podcasts, that they all seem to go through this sort of phase where they become Muslim, and they're in that anti-establishment, counterculture mindset, and they all have this sort of zealot phase.
Yeah.
So you'll have the one guy who would, go with the Ayatollah Khomeini fatwa and talk on TV and say,
he needs someone rush there. I would assist them to find him, and he better hope that I never find him myself, or I will let the Ayatollah know exactly where he is. But then when they press him on this issue, he doubles back and says, hey, I never said that I was taken out of context. It's like, you were on a panel of 5 people and said you'd kill a man. You would literally said, I'm going to commit murder. Right? So these type
him, and there's so many of them. They're the ones who would say stuff about, they would make dua against the rulers of the Arab world, like Allah yukhilidun or these kind of things. Or they talk about, one of them made a comment about some certain ruling family in Pakistan.
Yeah.
May as well be an abortion, be one of that family.
Yeah.
There was the other guy who talked about Islam entering every home in America.
That's it, and the Sharia will be everywhere. And then when he was
whether
pressed,
they like it or not.
That's it, whether they like it or not. And when Bill Morris pressed him, he says, "Well, that was an earlier phase of my life." And he's like, "That's 4 years ago."
Yeah.
That was 4 years ago. That wasn't an earlier phase in your life. You weren't 17 when you said that.
Yeah, it wasn't a youthful enthusiasm.
Yeah, it was 4 years ago.
Yeah,
Wow.
so they all had that phase, and I think what I put down in my book, The Big Step, is that it was 9/11 that kind of turned the lights off, where it's like, it's not so cool to be Muslim. It's no longer trendy.
Yeah, it's no longer trippy. It's no longer trippy and trendy, in which you can be a rebel without consequence. Because now what happened is, being a Muslim has consequences.
Yeah, real consequences.
Before you could talk crazy and talk about, yes, we'll do this and we'll do that, and no consequences came back. You were just that cool guy with a big beard that wore nice robes.
Yeah.
But now, after those events took place, now you say these statements, and men in black suits come and visit you and say, "What did you say about our president? What did you say about America?" Now you have to stand or fall based upon what you said. And so now what happened is they doubled back because of fear and other reasons, and they started changing their tune.
Yeah, because it was no longer fashionable to be that kind of Muslim anymore. So they calmed down, and that's why they keep coming up with these comments. Like we saw one video before. There's one of these spokesmen from the West appears in a Hindu temple.
Yeah,
and there's so much we can learn from Lord Krishna.
That's it. There's an idol right in back of it.
Yeah.
I mean, recently there were a group of them that went to the state of Israel, the area under the state of Israel's control. They went there, and there's a picture of them at the Wailing Wall.
Yeah.
It's like, do you understand there's worship happening of a false religion right in front of you? You're physically there. Why are you there? That just enrages me. It's like, you're not supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And so when I first saw that, I put up a picture of it on the blog, and Imam Mansour al-Bahuti's ruling on this matter. So whoever would say that going to a Christian church, one may gain nearness to Allah, or that Allah will pleased with that or loves it, there's no doubt this person is a kafir.
Yeah.
Right? Because people take these things for something light, or these people take it for something light. And it's not something light, it's something heavy. Yeah. These are false religions.
Yeah. And then they have this thing, and what they started doing again after 9/11, changing the discourse, is they started saying stuff like, well, we have so much in common. Yeah. We have so much in common. There's so much in common between Islam and Christianity, or Islam and Judaism.
Yeah, we're all the same.
We're all the same again. And that's going back to that.
Yeah, that whole thing.
Joseph Campbell way of thinking.
That's it. And what happens to people is, people that might have been interested in Islam because of what Islam was, reject it because they're told that, wait a minute, they're saying Islam is just like Judaism and Christianity. Well, I've rejected that husk.
Yeah. Because it's been hollowed out.
Yeah, it's been hollowed out. There's no teeth. It's toothless. Yeah. So now you're telling me Islam's the same thing as, okay, well, I'll reject that too. I'll reject that as well. Yeah. And because they think, there have been people that have said, Islam is a beautiful religion, it's great. It just needs to be sweetened a little bit. What do you mean sweetened a little bit? Sweetener can give you cancer. What do you mean sweetened? And they'll say, well, what it is maybe we need to present it in a different way. No, it's fine being presented. It's just fine. And it's offensive enough as it is. You don't need to add to the offense. Yeah. And it's sweet just as well as it is. You don't need to add sweetener. You know what happens when you add sweetener to drinks, when you add sweetener to candy bars. It's dangerous.
Yeah, that's what one of the things I point out in my book as well, that you have, that when they do that, the way these people present Islam, especially the way they're presenting Islam since 2001, is they've been presenting it in this sugar-coated fashion, this big white fluffy teddy bear fashion. And what it means is that someone learns about Islam, and they're only told ABC about Islam. They're told, oh, Islam is this, this, and this. And they go, okay, then they accept. But then they find out later on, wait, Islam is also meant to be D, E, F, and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And they, oh, I didn't sign up for that.
Yeah.
And then they leave.
Yeah.
Because what you're getting is essentially
to increase the recidivism rates.
Yeah, you're getting a high maintenance, a low quality convert.
Yeah.
Who's really going to struggle. Didn't know what he was signing up for in the beginning, and then.
Wait a minute, there's a group of people who are punished with eternal judgment for rejecting faith? Hey, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I thought in the end we all go. I thought we're all on the train, all the oxen free, everyone's saved. I thought that's what it was. No, that's not what it is.
Yeah. So that's what I think we've covered everything we need to cover here, but this is a very, very important thing I think that people should be keeping in mind here, because we have these discussions all the time about people are asking about spokesmen for Islam in the West, and I get these questions a lot, thing that, could we give them the benefit of the doubt? Could we hope? Of course we pray for their guidance. We hope that they do come around, but we have to understand where they're coming from, the education system they went through.
Yeah.
I mean, I was given information recently. I think one of these spokesmen for Islam in the West, he was saying that, this is quite shocking. He said that the Muslim or the man never really understood logic, but the Catholics did.
Yeah.
And therefore, like at his own little college over there, he's got a Catholic, I think a Franciscan teaching logic.
Yeah, they've also. It's also other statements have been made that they never really understood the theory of evolution. If only they understood it properly, then they wouldn't have said that it's kufr. And they, any Muslim scholar that reads the Constitution can see that the same things are at work in the Constitution as in the revealed law. Yeah. And it's like, are you feeling okay?
Yeah.
Have you suffered a head injury, like a blunt force trauma? Because that's the only thing that would explain why you're coming to those conclusions. People that sit down and read the Quran and read it from cover to cover, and then read the U.S. Constitution, and then also read Thomas Jefferson's notes on it and why he chose the wording for it and everything else, can see that there are entirely two different sets of laws. And there's two different sets of machinery behind these. Two different sets of machinery. One is written on hemp paper, which is smokable. The other is written on vellum. Yeah. Camel skin, which is meant to be there forever. Yeah. So it's just two different understandings of the world.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I've noticed the past, because we've been discussing the past few days. So one thing I've noticed in the past few years, because I asked you this question, I said, why is it that, for example, you and I, we sit down, we talk about translation projects, and we talk about what books do people need, what books should be put out there. There needs to be a fiqh book, there needs to be a book on Hajj, there needs to be a book on theology. We're always talking about these points. And then I think I asked you a few days ago, I said, well, how these people who have been Muslim, since the 1970s or so forth,
60s,
or even earlier in the 60s, why haven't they done these things? Yeah. And I think the answer you gave me was that they never saw that anything was wrong.
Yes.
They never saw anything. All the major things that these people, especially these hippie converts, the major things that they've translated tend to be just books about character, books about purification of the heart, and these things. But they haven't gone into a critique of the governmental system out here, a critique of the banking system. Yeah. In-depth theology. Even
though all these things are there, it doesn't matter what, when you're looking at the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, the Malikis, those things are all freely available and they're easy to find. Yeah. They're ubiquitous in those three schools. You can find plenty of literature on this. Yeah. So it's not like they're starved for choice. Yeah. They're spoiled for choice. Yeah. In those three schools, they're spoiled for choice on those matters.
Yeah, that literature is available as written by contemporary Maraja.
In Arabic. And they're conversant in the language. Why wouldn't they?
And they're not bringing that stuff into English. Yeah. They're not.
And it becomes a situation where you have to start saying, okay, we're no longer talking about they can't do it. We're talking about they won't do it. Yeah. We're not talking about they don't know. They do know, but they've chosen not to bring it into because of whatever reason. And yes, character is important and it's perfectly fine. But without the revealed law, you have nothing. And without the right belief, the correct theology, you have nothing. Because those good deeds, good as they may be, they render no value if they don't have the sound theology.
Yeah, and it also makes me think that even if they did want to, even if they thought they'd like to translate more books, they're not going to find a lot of books in Arabic by our ulama that totally concur with their view of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, they're going to find books that are really hostile to that way of thinking, and they'll be thinking, okay, well, they belong to an older age.
No, it's like who from your perennial faculty would actually happily walk into your place?
Yeah. Could you get Ahmad Zarruq to come in and give you a tazkiyah on evolution? You know, the very people who were your contemporaries, who were standing shoulder to shoulder with you in the beginning, are now eviscerating you. Because they're saying, no, this is what they're teaching, this is falsehood. They're actually attacking you in separate lectures. Because they've realized the error that's in what you're teaching as spokesman for Islam in the West. They've seen the error, so they're attacking you.
So, if we look into the future, just to finish on this point, we're looking into the future, and I think we discussed this last year in the podcast on our failures, our loss. Is this now going to, are we going to now see, I think we said this last year, we're going to see a sort of an American Islam eventually emerge with its own theology, its own fiqh, its own way of doing things?
It will be completely separate. What we're on the verge of seeing is a form of Islam, lowercase I, that will be completely separate to what the Muslims in the heartland Muslim countries recognize. It will be completely different, to where it will be seen as a different religion altogether. And it will be because it will be so alien in terms of the theology. It will be so alien in terms of fiqh. It will be so alien in terms of conduct and everything else and mannerisms that no Muslim upon Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Muslim orthodoxy, as it's said in English, no Muslim will be able to recognize what that is. Not only will he refuse to recognize it because this is wrong, but I mean, he actually won't be able to apprehend or comprehend what exactly it is they're doing. And these people might even say, we're Muslim. It will look to them, if someone can study this, that form of Islam will look to them like Seinfeld's Judaism will look to a Haredi Orthodox Jew. It will look like that.
That's a good example. That's a good analogy. And what about in the UK? What do you think is going to happen in the UK?
The UK will have the same thing, but what will happen is the form of Islam that's being offered in the UK will become a state-sponsored, government-sponsored form of Islam. And there will be pockets of Muslims in spread out areas that will form, but they will find themselves, if they take a wrong step with the state Islam, they will find themselves possibly facing jail time or other things like that, because this form of British Islam that's being formed is stridently pro-government to the point of actually serving the government's needs, even when it's wrong, and when it's even when the right, when it's transgressing, when it's neutral, when it's just no matter what. We are with this earthly, fleshly, ruling, carnal system, and we will not stop.
Because we discussed that yesterday, the way the nature of the masjids out in these countries, and that's basically what their function is. They're just going to become sort of control apparatus.
I mean, I would say in capping some of this off, because someone would say, okay, we understand what's happened. How do we then break free of this mindset? Then, because we've spent 15 years, we understand, gone through the structure, people have gone through this structure, so then how would we break free of it? I would say, in answer to this, there are 5 ways that you would break free from this structure. The first is a proper and sound study of your theology, a deep study of your theology, deep study of your theology, and understanding what it is we believe. You should spend a good amount of time on that. Most of the Quran contends with what people believe and what they don't believe. Most of it contends with that. That's one of the most important things you could deal with, is what you believe. The second is to understand what you've been taught in school, to go back over these things, social things you've been taught, and to rebuild from that. What that means is reading books about the early generations of Muslims, reading books about our scholars of old, and understanding where your mindset is supposed to be, changing your mindset. And you'll recognize yourself, you'll catch yourself saying certain kufri things that, I'm not supposed to understand that, right? To properly get clear from this whole thing, I mean, it might take someone less time, but for me, it took me like about 10 years to where I'm totally divested from it. I have no connection to it. I'm not interested in it. I don't have any vestiges of it left. I just got rid of it. It took about 10 years. So you've got the sound theology, reading about the books of people of the old, reading history as well, understanding what happened to people who also had these ideas or advocated them in their destruction. Number 3, surrounding yourself with the good company. Right company of the people who are also understanding the same thing and want to go. If you're with someone that still thinks that, oh, well, I went to these schools and I turned out all right, everything else. No, you didn't turn out all right. Because if you turned out all right, then you would, if you really turned out all right, you would have opposed that system. You wouldn't be in conformity with it.
Yeah.
You'd be in opposition to that system. And there should be, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, there should be some friction in your daily life because you're swimming upstream and everyone else is swimming downstream.
Yeah.
The 4th thing is, do not send your children in their formative years to these institutions. You saw what you went through. You know what you went through. You know the brainwashing, the kufr and the shirk and all these things that you imbibed. Do not send your children to these institutions. That doesn't mean don't let them play at the park. Don't let them have friends that aren't Muslim or whatever else. But these systems should not be in charge of the education of your children. That's not their business. That's not their affair. That's your affair. Their primary education, their formative years is their business. Now, if your children after their formative years want to go to college or university, that's fine because by that time, their formative structure is set. So if they say, well, I'm going to study to be a mechanic, that's fine. Because when you're in university or college, the kufri things that would have been done as compulsory aren't required. Those are elective classes and you can get rid of them and you can say, oh, I'm not taking those. I just want to take classes on automotive. And you can do that. The 5th thing I would say is for Muslims living in the United States, Canada, and the UK that I think they're going to be here long term is to create small communities. Forget about this whole big masjid building community thing. That's dead. That era is finished. That era is done for. The era that we're in now is small, close-knit, compact, concise, focused groups of Muslims that are working together in small family units. 10 families here, 5 families there. Make sure you have a curriculum planned out. So what you want to learn, because you still need to learn it out. You've been through this whole Kafir system. You need to create a curriculum for you. What your curriculum's going to be for your creed, your fiqh, to get through that, to fix the damage that's been done to you. And then you have a curriculum for your children to prevent damage being done to them. Because you've damaged yourself mentally, there's also the physical damage you might have done by allowing people to inject foreign antibodies into you, and that's a whole other discussion. So you've done physical and mental damage to yourself. So you have to fix these things.
Okay, and I would just give as a closing tip, I think just something from my experience as someone, I went through the whole system. If you listen to the podcast last year, I mean, I went through the schooling in Canada and Denmark and the university in this country. And my thing is language. I'm a linguist, so I think language has a psychological effect. The language you use, and you want to correct the language you use. And I actually learned this from you way back in the day. Whereas if you want to get yourself out of the secular mindset, I mean, you have to catch yourself as to how you talk about Islam and how you talk about Allah, right? So for example, instead of saying Islam says, no, Allah says. Allah and His messenger say. The messenger of Allah ﷺ commands this.
Scholars have concurred.
Scholars concur this. Or my Lord is pleased with this for me.
Yeah.
Talk about Allah as if He's actually real. Don't talk about it as if it's a constitution.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the Quran. Don't say the Quran says. The Quran says. Say Allah says.
Yeah.
And you'll know, and then that will have an effect because you'll notice these spokesmen for Islam in the West. They never say Allah says.
Yeah.
It's always the Quran says. The Quran says. The Quran says.
Our tradition.
Yeah, our tradition is horrible.
Which is again, that's Joseph Campbell again.
That aberrant term, yeah. And there's a good, I might link that below. There's a good video where Imam Al-Bolti talks about this as well. He talks about be careful with the language we use because if you say, the Hajj is a tradition or the Quran is not the Quran, but the prayer is a tradition. He says, what is a tradition? A tradition is all a tradition is. It's just something that people have done over generations. That's his only claim to validity is that it was
subject to modification.
Yeah, it's subject to modification and it's subject to abrogation, right? So if you start saying, well, Islam is all these traditions, all these traditions. Well, traditions can just be discarded. They can be tossed away.
Changed.
Or, yeah, if not changed. So it's very, very important the language you use. If you want to get out of the secular mindset, you have to check the language you use. Don't say Islam says and the Quran says. Say Allah has said. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ has commanded. The ulama have commanded. This is our ruling on the matter. This is not our tradition. I think that's a very, very important point to bear in mind. Check the language you're using.
Yes.
And I think we'll finish on that point. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.